This audio documentary is brought to you by Horror, the first time America's Paranoia infected the world, my own book on the international war on comic books that occurred during the 1950s. Now, I'm going to start this with a confession. Well, okay, that may be the wrong word. Just like a movie, my original draft for the book contained far more than the copy I hope is currently in your hot little hands, contained a lot more information than it does. For about a year, my publisher just kept on at me. Trim, cut, slash, get rid of this, get rid of that. And I'm not saying it was wrong, but it did shorten the book considerably. And during that process, I came up with an idea of this director's cut. Perhaps we could release bonus material like all the things that were cut out or extended of any chapter that had been edited down. So this is kind of part of that process. And this has been something I've been thinking of doing for quite a while. Now, having been researching this book for 20 years, I have to say that the war on comic books in the 40s and 50s, rarely do we have a complete original source that I'll be presenting here today. Normally it's snippets, it's bits of information, it might be a letter here, a letter there, it might be an article in a newspaper, but rarely do we have like a first-hand account in the voice, the actual voice of those involved. And that's why I felt this was a very important part of the book, a very important part of the process, and an important part of the war on comics. So I felt like we should probably highlight that here. Now, another admission is that yes, this does appear in my book Horror, but in a vastly modified way. So I hope you'll enjoy this, and if you do, please pick up a copy of Horror at your local Amazon site. Since 1935, America's Town Meeting of the Air was a radio program produced by NBC and then much later by ABC Radio. And it somewhat replicated the old-style town hall meetings where you'd get a very large audience and you'd get some guests in front of that audience. You would have a moderator who'd control the proceedings, and they would not so much argue but put across their own points on an important matter of the day. And apparently this show was quite well received. It started off small but became incredibly popular. So it was famous for getting influential newsmakers of the day, and they'd come in to discuss a current affair in front of this large audience. And the producer and moderator was a guy called George V. Denny Jr. He actually began as a professor of drama productions at UNC, before eventually moving to New York and became an actor on Broadway. Later he became a director at Columbia University's Institution of Arts and Sciences, and became a director of the League for Political Education there. But at some point he started producing this radio program, which became very successful, and in fact gained a lot of respect in a lot of media circles because of its determination to tackle almost any subject, thanks to its belief that an educated people were a strong people. So as we mentioned, one of the program's main draw cards was its live audience. With a large audience reacting immediately to what they heard, be it good or bad, the format gave listeners at home a real sense of participation, that they felt like they were there because you could hear the audience reacting. And it could have been booing, it could have been applauding, but it gave the whole series atmosphere. And it helped that the audience in the auditorium were also later allowed to participate, and they would give very short, pointed questions that would be answered and never allowed the process to bog down. In my research, I discovered that America's Town Meeting became so popular that in more remote areas, they created clubs, and that on the night of the performance or on the night of the recording, people would show up and listen to it in a large group. And then after the radio program ended, they could then themselves sit there and discuss and talk about what they just heard. And it really could have been about anything of the topic of the day, such as exactly how free America's press was, or if the country should enter the Second World War, which was clearly a very important topic at the time. On the evening of March 2nd, 1948, radio listeners across America tuned into what was the 498th episode of the program. You could clearly hear the large audience was buzzing with anticipation at what this episode would be about. And then, eventually, the town crier that always started this program stepped up and made his announcement.
Here, Al Capp, John Mason Brown, Marya Mannes, and George Hecht. Hear both sides on Town Meeting Tonight. Town Meeting Tonight. Everybody listen.
Following this was George Denny Jr., and he'd take over the microphone.
Good evening, neighbors. I'm sure that during the day most of you have read your favorite newspaper, and if you scan the headlines of the front page, they probably read something like this. Vandenberg urges speed to balk threat against peace by Russia. Aviation Board asks 35,000 warplanes, says attack on U.S. is possible. But the really important news for a great many Americans, I suspect, is not found on the front pages, or in most cases, even in the front sections of their newspapers. Indeed, a summary of the important events of the day for some 40 million people might sound something like this. Dick Tracy smashes villainous shoulders, or Daddy Warbucks returns, or Fearless Fosdick captures Chippendale chair. Probably more Americans read the comic page than any other feature of their newspaper, and hundreds of different comic magazines may be purchased at any newsstand in the country. Is it any wonder, then, that your town meeting has decided to explore this world of fantasy that has captured the interest of Americans of all ages? Let's take a trip to the land of the comics and find out what really makes it tick. Why do comic pages draw more readers than front pages? Is this good or is it bad? Is there anything wrong with the comics? Our guests, John Mason Brown and Marya Mannes, both authors and lecturers, feel that there most emphatically is something wrong, and they'll tell you in no uncertain terms in just a moment. On the other hand, Mr. George Hecht, publisher of Parents Magazine and other publications, and Al Capp, creator of Little Abner, comes staunchly to the defense of this $60 million industry. Parents and children, psychiatrists and psychologists, churchmen and laymen, GIs and John Does hold strong opinions on this question. So let's hear first from one of the nimblest minds in the world of literature, Mr. John Mason Brown, author and critic and associate editor of the Saturday Review of Literature and town hall lecturer. Mr. Brown.
John Mason Brown was a long-time New York drama critic with a very large nose that could have belonged to a boxer. I'm thinking that being a drama critic in New York, perhaps that explained his pugilist nose. His column, Seeing Things, appeared in the Saturday Review, and he'd already begun attacking comic books and their growing influence on American society.
The comics, alas, like death and taxes, are very much with us, and to my way of thinking, they are equally unfunny. Why they are called comics, when people who read them, young and old, always look like so many undertakers during the reading, eludes me. But we'll let that pass. Just as most of us as parents have had to let comics pass into our homes, against our wills, against our wishes, against our better judgment. I love comedians, the highest, the lowest, and the toughest, and I love cartoons too. But my allergy to comics is complete, utter, absolute. I know there are bad comics, and I am told there are good comics. I've read them, a few of both, only a few, fortunately, under protest. But I regret them both. I deplore them, and to continue the understatement, I abhor them. So far as I am concerned, they might just as well be written in a foreign language for which no dictionary has ever been published, and I wish they had been. Let me quickly admit that I am low enough, and sometimes defeated enough as a parent, to make use of comics. I mean in desperate moments, when of a rainy Sunday morning or afternoon I want peace in the home, or when I'm traveling with my two sons on a train and I need to subdue them. Then, yes, I'll confess it, then I do resort to comics, without shame, without conscience. On such occasions, I don't so much distribute comics as I administer them to my sons. Much as a barkeep would pour out Mickey Fins, or a doctor distribute hypodermics, as knockout drops for unruly children, as sedatives, as Maxim silencers, comics do have their undeniable uses. This much I'll concede gratefully, Mr. Hecht. I'll also grant that so long as other people's children read comics, we have scant hope, and perhaps less right, to keep ours from doing so. It would be unfair for us to deny to our children what is now a group experience, and when they have grown up will have become a group memory for their generation. If I hate the comics, I promise you I have my reasons for doing so. I know that as a part of every healthy diet, everyone needs a certain amount of trash. Each generation has always found its own. The comic books, however, as they are nowadays perpetually on tap, seem to me not only to be trash, but the lowest, most despicable, and most harmful and unethical form of trash. As a rule, their word selection is as wretched as their drawing or the paper on which they are printed. They are designed for readers who are too lazy to read and who don't want to read anyway. I won't and can't deny that comic books fascinate the young, as in terms of pigs, rabbits, rodents, morons, hillbillies, and supermen. They tell their illustrated stories. But as a writer, I resent the way in which they get along with the poorest kind of writing. I hate their lack of style. I hate their appeal to illiterate literates. I loathe their bad grammar, their tiresome toughness, their cheap thrills, and their imbecilic laughter. I hate them for making only the story count and not the how of its telling. I detest them in spite of their alleged thrills and gags because they have no subtlety and certainly no beauty. Their power of seduction, I believe, lies in the fact that they make everything too easy. They substitute bad drawing for good description. They reduce the wonders of the language to crude monosyllables and to narratives printed, which are really nothing but printed motion pictures. What riles me when I see my children absorbed by the comics is my awareness of what they are not reading and could be reading. In other words, of the more genuine and deeper pleasures they could and should be having. To compare Bugs Bunny or Donald Duck with the Jungle Book or even the Travels of Babar, and to set Wanda, the Wonder Woman, against Alice in Wonderland, or Batman and Robin, Dick Tracy and Gene Autry against Treasure Island, or Little Abner, if Mr. Capp will forgive me, against Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer, or Superman and Captain Marvel against Jules Verne or Gulliver's Travels, is to realize that between the modern cave drawing, which a comic book really is, and a real book, a good book, there is, to put it mildly, a difference, a tragic difference, which is hard on the young and may be harder on the future. Anatole France once described even the best books as being the opium of the Occident. Well, most comics, as I see them, are the marijuana of the nursery. They are the bane of the bassinet. They are the horror of the home, the curse of the kids, and a threat to the future. The comics offer final and melancholy proof that even among the young, the mind is the most unused muscle in the United States.
Apparently at this point, Brown took a very long bow, having succeeded in getting his point across and winning over some of the crowd. You can clearly hear they were quite interested in what he had to say, and he stepped away from the microphone with a big grin and a gesture that suggested, "Follow that if you dare." Now here we'll take a break from our normal programming, because it's often mentioned that Brown took his seat and was followed by artist and writer Al Capp. Well, this is simply not the case, as you will hear. Following Brown was actually George Hecht. Now, Hecht was a publisher that concentrated on printing educational comics and magazines. As you'll hear, his speech was quick and all about statistics and influences, and he was clearly determined to defend the comic industry, which he loved.
Now, Mr. Hecht, as a successful publisher of Parents Magazine and a number of comic magazines, in spite of Mr. Brown, including True Comics, Jack Armstrong, and other magazines for young people, what have you to say about his criticism? Ever since he graduated from Cornell in 1917, George Hecht has made a success with publishing magazines which give useful information to parents and children. And we're very happy to welcome him on America's Town Meeting of the Year. Mr. Hecht.
Nearly everybody, Mr. Brown notwithstanding, reads and enjoys the comics. Judge Albert Gary, when he was chairman of the board of directors of the United States Steel Corporation, once said that at a board meeting he found that every single member of the board of the United States Steel read the comics. The comics provide good entertainment and exciting adventure. There's far too little fun in this troubled world. In addition to comics that appear in the newspapers, there are, believe it or not, 246 different comics magazines. It is estimated that 40 million copies of comics magazines are sold each month on the newsstands. Surveys made by impartial research firms reveal that 91 out of every 100 boys and girls 6 to 17 years of age read the comics magazines, and only 9 out of 100 do not read them at all. Perhaps the most indisputable proof of the appeal of the comics magazine is that in the army camps during the war, comics magazines outsold even the best-selling magazines like Life, Saturday Post, and Reader's Digest, and as a matter of fact, outsold them 10 to 1. The comics are really a new means of communication, just as radio and television are new means of communication. I don't think that most people realize this. Comics are a series of pictures with a minimum of text that can be read with ease and speed. Many comic magazines consist of exciting adventure stories. All children crave adventures and should have some of it, even if it is only vicarious. Josette Frank, the children's book consultant of the Child Study Association of America, who has for years been studying the comics and who wrote a book about them, recently wrote, "Children read comic magazines because they find in them the satisfaction of some real innermost need of their own. In this modern world, children find too little opportunity for real adventure. Therefore, the comics act as a release for their pent-up emotions, as an escape mechanism, as a safety valve. The comics are really the folklore of today." The U.S. Armed Services use the comics as a means of teaching soldiers and sailors how to operate various weapons and how to conduct themselves in battle. They found that soldiers and sailors learned more rapidly by means of the comics. In True Comics, which is one of the magazines that our company publishes, we teach children history and science and current events via the comics. Through special comic folders, industrial workers are taught lessons of safety and health via the comics. On the other hand, I admit there are a small percentage of comic magazines that I consider harmful to young readers. There are a number of comic magazines on the stands that are extremely sexy and unduly deal with the activities of criminals, which magazines I do admit are harmful to the young. Some educational authorities declare that all comic magazines are bad. On the other hand, there are certain eminent child psychologists who state that all comic magazines are good for children, inasmuch as they teach them about life. I'm not in either camp. I believe that there are good comic magazines and bad comics, just as there are good books and bad books, good motion pictures and bad motion pictures. I do not believe that comic magazines should be censored by the government. I believe that the comic magazine publishers themselves should initiate a system of self-censorship, just as the motion picture producers have for years have had an organization to censor those pictures that would otherwise bring the movie industry into disrepute. I have been active in forming an association of the comic magazine publishers, and we are now in the process of drafting a code which we fervently hope all publishers will live up to. I believe, Mr. Brown, that parents and teachers should not condemn all comics indiscriminately, but should encourage children to select the better comics and to avoid the inferior ones. The better comics should be commended and publicized, just as the better motion pictures are commended and publicized by women's clubs, educational and church groups, and better film counsels. But no matter how you feel about the comics, there seems only one inescapable conclusion. The comics are here to stay. There is nothing wrong with the comics that good publishing cannot and will not correct.
Now, Hecht mumbled and stammered his way through what's clearly a statement he'd been reading from, again revealing he was inexperienced at public speaking, and this really does come across. There's little of the natural flair that Brown had during his part in this radio program. Hecht never stopped to allow his points to sink in, or for the audience to clap and cheer. Instead, he just seemed to have ploughed on, perhaps wanting it to get it over as quickly as possible, and then at the end you can hear that the audience gave him a polite round of applause and he took his seat. Can you sum up what Hecht's point was? Well, I think it's pretty simple in that one line.
The comics are here to stay. There is nothing wrong with the comics that good publishing cannot and will not correct.
Our next speaker, Miss Marya Mannes, comes from a family of distinguished artists. Her father is David Mannes, and her uncle is Walter Damrosch. She's done sculpturing, she's written documentary movies, poetry, articles, and stories, which have been published widely. More recently, her first novel, Message from a Stranger, was published this spring by the Viking Press. Miss Mannes has very positive opinions on tonight's question, so we are happy to hear them on America's Town Meeting of the Air. Miss Mannes.
Certainly, Mr. Hecht, the comics are here to stay. If they weren't, Mr. Brown and I wouldn't be so angry. But I will open my attack with a kind word. I am all in favor of adults looking at comic strips in the newspapers. It keeps them from reading the editorials. And since, by some curious coincidence, the most popular strips are neighbors of the most irresponsible press, this is an excellent thing. The strips save people from contamination and also from thought, a maturing process which is definitely un-American. My fight is against the power of comic books over children because I consider them first and foremost a colossal waste of time, the infinitely precious time of growth. A time of growth. A child grows by learning, by playing, and by dreaming. Comics supply none of these needs. They do not teach, Mr. Hecht, unless you consider education a series of facts coated with the laxative of fiction. They are not play because the child is passive reading them, and they kill dreams. They kill dreams by presenting the child with ready-made images and ready-made ideas that leave him nothing to create by himself. They do not stimulate imagination, they substitute for it. Comics replace fantasy, which is the soul of the child, with contrived formulas of an adult mind which knows a good business when it sees one. The business of selling 40 million comic books a month to children who cannot discriminate. Comic books are not only a waste of time, but a waste of eyesight. With few exceptions, comics are very ugly. Bad in drawing, bad in color, bad in print. The human beings in them are ugly even when they are meant to be handsome. The stalwart young men with coat-hanger shoulders and nutcracker jaws are travesties of the male. The bosomy, over-painted, and abysmally vulgar women are travesties of the female. The so-called funny characters are merely repulsive. The crime and horror comics are not only ugly in appearance, but ugly in thought. Oh yes, they make it clear that crime doesn't pay. They're full of righteous conclusions and sentiments where right triumphs and wrong is punished. But right triumphs by force and violence. Right triumphs by the fist and by the gun. The impact of the fist on the jaw is the comic's law. It is an ugly law. Comics language is in the main ugly. It perverts the English language with slang, with sloppy contractions, with bad grammar. It is the speech of the vulgar and the illiterate, or, at the other extreme, so stilted in an effort towards correctness that it becomes laughable. I'm all for laughing, but I choose my comedy. There are, of course, exceptions. It would be dishonest to deny the harmlessness of some. The Disney comics, a few westerns, some teenage strips, or the charm and humor of a strip like Happy the Humbug. It would be dishonest to deny the efforts of some others, like True Comics, which my opponent, Mr. Hecht, publishes, to supply the child with truth instead of horror. It would be dishonest to deny the homespun comedy of Lil Abner, don't mention it, Mr. Capp, or the gentle satire of a strip like Mr. and Mrs. In measured doses, these can supply relaxation and entertainment to which a child has every right. But the doses are not measured. Comic books are the addiction of 3 out of 4 American homes. In 1 out of 3 American homes, they are virtually the only reading matter. Repeat, the only reading matter. 40 million children are growing up on this kind of nourishment or this total absence of nourishment. For comics are not food, they are a drug. They are killers, killers of time. What an indictment of our time that it has to be killed. What an indictment of a way of life that a child has nothing better to do than read the comics. I know by heart the arguments of the defense. Mr. Hecht has already given most of them. Comics, they say, supply a universal human need for adventure, for excitement. They're merely today's version of yesterday's dime novels or the fairy tales of the past. Nonsense. Even the cheapest dime novels our fathers read as boys demanded the ability to read and to imagine. As for fairy tales and legends, they are the accretions of human experience. They are not the commercial stencils of businessmen and syndicates. The defense will say, comics give an outlet to the aggressive needs of children. Nonsense. The aggressive needs of children can be satisfied far more naturally by a game of prisoner's base. Comics are not an outlet, they're a sublimation. The final triumphant argument for the defense is, comics give people what they want, therefore they are all right. Fine. Children want to go to the movies every day, listen to the radio all night, and never go to school. Is that all right? I say it is not. I say with Mr. Brown that the comic book is the greatest opiate on the market. I say that with few exceptions it is a killer of time and a killer of the imagination. I believe it keeps the child from the joy of reading, the excitement of thought, and the happiness of play. And I believe that a steady, uncontrolled, and indiscriminate diet of comic books can stunt a child's mental and spiritual growth just as much as a steady malnutrition can stunt his physical growth. Those who make comics may not be in the business for their health, but they should be in it for our children's health. Until they are, they stand guilty of more than taking candy from a baby. They are taking imagination from the child, and that is a crime.
As you heard, Marya Mannes was a famous New York critic and writer who'd later become editor at Vogue and produced pieces for magazines such as The New Yorker, The Reporter, and American Life. Now, Mannes was a fashionable lady, and images of her show that her hair was short, with her cut as stylish as the dress she was wearing. And yet I'd have to say her tone is clearly very similar to that of Hecht. There was very little humour, and again it's very clear she's reading a prepared statement. Although I will say, at least Mannes does stop at one point and occasionally does acknowledge her fellow speakers. So the audience is clearly getting into this, and so are the speakers, and so is George Denny Jr., who at this point steps in as though he's a ring announcer in a prize fight, and he's announcing the heavyweight champion about to step into the ring.
Now I'm sure that all of our listeners, all readers rather, of Little Abner wish we had television here tonight so that they could see the creator of their favorite comic. There are those who say he resembles his brainchild. But the only obvious resemblance is that both are broad-shouldered, black-haired, and frequently get into scraps. Well, Mr. Capp is in one tonight, and he has the 4th position. But he will no sooner finish speaking his piece than Mr. Brown and Miss Mannes will be able to strike back at him right here in front of this microphone. So let's hear now from the creator of the nation's most popular comic, Al Capp of New York. Mr. Capp.
There must have been a lot of innocent little kids who listened. I'm sure they were frightened to death listening to Mr. Brown tell them what's wrong with their comics. I'd like to hear a town hall forum of the same kids on the subject, what's wrong with dramatic critics. They might, with complete righteousness, make the same complaints about dramatic critics that Mr. Brown makes about comic strips, like, for instance, dramatic critics are a waste of time. Dramatic critics are very unfunny. They're bad for the eyes. They're untrue to life. They're horrible to think about. Dramatic critics are not only the bane of the bassinet, they're the tidy service of the nursery. Of course, as any fool can plainly see, these kids would be wrong. Because kids just aren't the best judges of dramatic critics. And this point occurred to me during Mr. Brown's speech. Dramatic critics just aren't the best judges of kids. Now, this whole thing gives me an idea for one of my own contributions to juvenile delinquency, which I call, rather defiantly, my comic strip. The scene is a typical American home of a typical American family named Kinsey, of course. Supper... Supper is over, and seated in the living room are Mr. and Mrs. Kinsey and their 11-year-old son, Kingsblood. They're discussing what they've read in that day's typical American newspaper. Mr. Kinsey says he's mighty pleased about the new atomic bomb which can blast the bloody brains out of 200 or 300 million irritating foreigners, and then he chats about the prize fight in Chicago that resulted in one of the young athletes being punched to death in front of thousands of happy, cheering, typical American sports lovers. But Mrs. Kinsey is more interested in talking about the latest society divorce and the front-page excerpts from the fun-loving young matron's diary in which she refers with fine, wholesome frankness to her dates with 20 or 30 of her husband's dipsomaniac chums. Well, little Kingsblood has gone through all that, and frankly, it bored him. He's reading the one page of the family newspaper where there's real action, the comic page. Mrs. Kinsey, noticing that little Kingsblood isn't joining in this uplifting discussion of the front page of their family newspaper, glances over his shoulder and screams a typical, horrified American mother-type scream. "Look," she screams to Mr. Kinsey, "look at what your child is reading." "It's only Dick Gravy," replies little Kingsblood. I'm referring here to a certain detective comic strip, which shall remain nameless because I'm too shrewd to give a rival all this valuable publicity. "Only Dick Gravy, my eyes," snarls his mother. "Why, this thing is full of murder, crime, violence, and look, there's even a boy in it who doesn't think that a girl in it is repulsive, so it's full of sex, too." Mr. Kinsey speaks. He says, "I've been reading several articles lately by several psychologists or psychiatrists or something that state that these stories of murder, crime, violence, and sex are very bad stuff for kids." He says, "Why do you bother with that old comic page anyhow, son? Why don't you read the news, son? It's a son," he's talking. And "I did, Pop," replies the lad, "and oh boy, it's all full of murder, crime, violence," and he winks, "and sex too, Pop." Mr. Kinsey looks over the front page of the paper, and he's got to admit that the kid is right. He tears the newspaper up, cancels his subscription, and he says, then according to those articles by those critics and psychologists, news is bad stuff for kids, and those psychologists must be right because all the articles about psychologists all say they're always right, and those articles must be right because they're written by other psychologists. "Son," Mr. Kinsey says, pulling a volume off the bookshelf, "why don't you read a good book instead, like Oliver Twist?" "I read it," reports little Kinsey. "It's about a kid who falls in with a criminal named Fagin who teaches him how to commit crimes. And then there's a big gorilla in it named Sykes. He beats a girl to death and stop," cries his father. "Stop. I can see now that the work of Charles Dickens is very bad for kids, so he tears the works of Dickens all up. He feels he owes this to the psychologists." Now, Mr. Kinsey, with all those articles by the psychologists in his mind, goes through his typical American family bookshelf. He re-examines Treasure Island and Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. He finds several very deplorable murders and lots of rip-roaring crime and violence in them, and he tears them all up. He's very tired by this time. Alice in Wonderland has got to go because the Queen and that keep saying off with their heads, and that's not only violent, but it often results in death. Well, pretty soon, there's nothing left in the house except the phone book and a volume of Shakespeare. With a sigh, little Kingsblood picks up the volume of Shakespeare and begins to read, and with a loud roar of "No, no, no, my child," his father snatches it away from him in the nick of time. Says this book is full of stories of murder, crime, violence, and sex, he roars. "But Pop," whimpers little Kingsblood, "it's Shakespeare." "Fancy names don't fool me," replies his father. "I've read those articles by those critics and psychologists. If they're right, Shakespeare is poison for kids. If they're right, Shakespeare is a very bad influence." Comic strips are nothing new. They're as old a form as the written word itself. They're just combinations of pictures and text to tell stories. The Egyptians did them in their own way in the tombs of the pharaohs, and Milton Caniff and I do them now in our way. Comic strippers are storytellers, just the same as people who write radio shows and books and movies. Some of us are right, some of us are wrong. It's the same with psychologists and even dramatic critics. Some of them are right, some are wrong, but don't worry about the kids. They're usually right.
So as they said, Al Capp was by far the most popular artist at the time, especially comic book artist. And his series Little Abner was read all across the US. And you can hear how excited the audience was when he appeared, and they were riding along with everything he said. You can hear the laughter, the joy of listening to this man talk, and unlike the others, he's clearly a natural in front of an audience. I'm sure he's got a prepared statement, or at least point forms, but for most of it, it sounds like he's more telling a story that he's prepared rather than a statement. So as you can hear, after all four speakers have presented their pieces, they were all given a chance to reply against each other and question each other.
Seems to me a man who can write such a spontaneous script as that deserves as fine a critic as Mr. John Mason Brown. So will you step up, Mr. Brown, and let's hear from you again to start this discussion here around the mic, and I'll stand between you all. Mr. Brown?
Mr. Denny and Little Abner, may I say that no one could relish more than I do the picture of the Kinseys at home with little Kingsbird. It's one of the happiest family scenes that I've encountered in a long time. What bothers me, however, in what Mr. Capp has said, and humorously and delightfully said, is not the way of it saying in this case, but what is really at the sense of it, if there is any sense to it. He won a great deal of deserved laughter, but actually what he did was to reduce almost every classic that the world has known to sheer junk, merely on the basis of what is synopsis. The point of great writing is not the story alone told. It is, as I tried to hint earlier, it is the treatment given. It is the development. It is the reason for dealing with crime. The great tragedies have somehow wrung ecstasy out of suffering. They don't deal with murder for police court records. They're not the tales of people who go in for fratricide, matricide, but the comic people go in for insecticide and call that tragedy. I think he's wrong because what he admits they tell a story, but I go back to the point, what matters is the language used and the point of the storytelling and what is done to the human spirit by those words so released and so employed.
Mr. Capp, I guess that calls for a comment from you.
Well, I think that since this discussion of comics has now degenerated into a definition of what great writing is, that great storytelling doesn't depend on its form. The comic book is simply a form. Dickens might have written in comic books if he could have gotten a contract with George Hecht. There are writers today who are more vital, who have more talent than anything that appears in things like the Saturday Evening Post, or I'd better stop mentioning these magazines, but who are writing for comic magazines. And this I want to say, that the very last outpost of fine, imaginative illustration in America is the comic strip. That's where all the great illustrators are. Milton Caniff, Ray Van Buren, Frank Godwin, Alex Raymond. They're all on the comic pages.
Thank you. Now, Miss Mannes.
Before I ask Mr. Hecht the question, I would just like to say that Mr. Capp has plenty of humor but little humility. Otherwise, he wouldn't speak of himself and Dickens in the same breath, because Dickens is a creative artist and Mr. Capp is a conveyor belt. But I would like to ask Mr. Hecht. I'd like to ask Mr. Hecht just in what way he thinks comics are educational. I refer particularly to the digests of great classics. Let us play Moby Dick in comic form.
Mr. Hecht?
Children who read digested comics in comic form, in very many cases, go on to read the complete story in its entirety. Just as people, when they read digested novels in the Reader's Digest, are stimulated to read the entire book. It's been definitely demonstrated that children who are readers, children who read comics, also are readers of books. Children who get the habit of reading through the reading of comic strips go on to read good books too.
I will say, though Hecht hadn't done too well in his prepared statement, he does come out with a couple of pretty good lines, including this one.
children who get the habit of reading through the reading of comic strips go on to read good books too.
So after this initial to and fro, it all starts to get a bit nasty, with each speaker firing snide comments at each other, or trying to find a weakness that they can exploit.
Thank you. About time for one more comment, Mr. Brown.
May I just quickly say that obviously Mr. Hecht, a charming man, has been contaminated by the stuff that he publishes. You just heard that last sentence, and I object to comics because of what they did to the English language. You heard Mr. Hecht say that sometimes children who are teased by comics do read what he calls the complete story in its entirety. That is supposed to be good English.
Brown would go on to highlight a grammatical error in Hecht's talk, pointing it out that this was proof that comic book language even contaminated adults.
May I say that when Mr. Hecht in his first speech said that Mr. Gary and the United States Steel directors and the corporation read comics, every man of them, at that point the United States Steel sunk to a new low in the history of the American stock market.
Hecht countered this by asking,
I'd like to ask Mr. Brown what his own children think of his opinion of the comic magazine.
Mr. Hecht? Mr. Brown?
Mr. Hecht, they have been so corrupted by you that they love them. I try to confess I speak as a defeated parent, but they have already, I'm happy to say, begun to discriminate. Before I came here tonight, as a matter of fact, they had taken all the comics in the house away from me because they heard I was going to attack them.
After a short station break, the conversation was then turned over and opened up to the audience.
Now we're ready to take questions from our audience, and a truly representative one it is, for it appears that the whole comic industry has turned out for this discussion, and special delegations from such organizations as the Youth Builders, the Society for the Prevention of Crime, New York Bureau of Child Guidance are with us. Some of the nation's leading comic artists are also here tonight. And just glancing around, I see Gus Ebsen, creator of Andy Gump, and Rabin Van Buren, who draws A.B. and Slats, and Harry Higginson, who provides us with Penny. There's Ernie Bushmiller, who's made Nancy and Aunt Fritzy famous. And there's R.M. Brinkerhoff, whose Little Mary Mix-Up is another precocious muppet. And Sam Leff, who creates Curly Kill. And there's Al Poston, who draws Sweeney and Sons. And there's J. Irving, creator of Willie Doodle, and a great many others. I'm sorry we can't take them all in. Attendants are in the aisles with portable microphones, and members of the audience who want to ask questions are holding up number cards indicating the speaker to whom they want to address their question. We'll start right down here on the aisle with the lady in the hat.
I'm Claire Edelson, member of the Child Study Association of America, and my question is addressed to Mr. John Mason Brown.
Mr. Brown?
Because comic books have such a large reading audience, would you say that they act as an intellectual barometer of the American people?
Brown?
I am afraid to say that they act as an intellectual barometer of adults. The children have no chance. The children happen to like them. That is, I agree with Miss Mannes. The children are the people who are not as yet able fully to discriminate. But I think they do, alas, from the point of view of the number of elders who read them with blissful and ignorant contentment, prove that they are some barometer of what is the average American intellectual standard. I deplore that.
Apparently people who wanted to ask questions of the panel were given numbered cards to indicate which speaker they had a question for, and they would ask their question in a very short manner, though it doesn't sound like that they'd give a chance to then continue on this conversation if they didn't get the answer they were hoping for. Most of these questions were standard, but one question really rang out like a bell.
Well, now I wish we had television here, sure enough, because there's a lovely little tot with a pink ribbon on her head from Juvenile Jury. Come on, sweetheart, let's hear from you. Way up there in the balcony.
I'm Robin Morgan from Juvenile Jury, and there children come and they present their problems, and most of the problems, some of them are, shall we read funny books or not? So we usually say yes, but it depends on if the child means a mean, very exciting murder funny book, we'll definitely say no. But if it means a happy one, like Funny Man or Mighty Mouse or Felix the Cat, we'll definitely say yes. And we think that funny books help children to get more acquainted with pictures and help them to get more acquainted with reading. Don't you agree with us?
Well, bless your heart. Well, now, did any one of you speakers dare take that little girl on? She's made a nice speech, so let's go on.
I also like the next question that was asked of Brown.
Yes.
My name is Thomas Joyner from Bloomfield High School, and I direct my question to Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown?
In the Newark Star Ledger, famous stories of literature are told in comic form. Doesn't this present a good method of teaching children these famous stories?
And to give this man his credit, he did come back with an honest answer.
No, sir. May I quickly say to tell great stories or good stories or amusing stories in comic form is to destroy them. Because a story is written in words does not mean it can be reduced to pictures. Had a good writer, wanted to tell the story that way, he would have turned artist if he could have. But he chose his medium because he excelled at it. This country takes to synopses all the time, thinking that if it has read a synopsis, it has read the original. I personally have tried to point out that we as readers suffer under the national misapprehension that if we have seen an ice cube, we have seen a glacier. And the plot of a story is not the story in picture form or any other form.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. All right, the gentleman in the balcony.
I'm Rayburn Van Bjorn, who does the Abby and Slats comic strip. Yeah. And I've just listened to Mr. Brown's Hymn of Hate, and I just wonder if it's possible for Mr. Brown to give a fair criticism of comics when he is so consumed with hate that he couldn't possibly have followed the comic strips long enough to give them a fair trial.
Mr. Brown, would you stand up here and comment on that?
Who is the person? Where is he?
He's right up there. The gentleman with the receding forehead.
Sir, may I quickly say that I, in my youth, did read comic strips assiduously. I, in my youth, which is receding, was only exposed to them once a week. I was brought up on Little Nemo, which was innocuous enough. I was brought up on Buster Brown, which heaven knows did not hurt. I was brought up even on Mutt and Jeff, but I did have Desperate Desmond. Curses. I do not regularly read the comics now. I cannot pretend as an adult that I follow your pursuit, and that is that you apparently read them all the time.
Being the critic that he was, he still had a little dagger to stick in at the end.
I do, however, feel that I have read enough of them to abhor them. There is an old critical jargon, a phrase which insists you don't have to eat the whole of a rotten egg to know that it's rotten.
This answer, of course, brought an immediate response from our Capp, who jumped up and took over the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Now, Mr. Capp, that's a comment.
I thought Mr. Brown didn't read comics, but after hearing that he did as a child, I give up. The fact that he read comics as a kid, and it's made this kind of man out of him, is the proof that they're bad.
And now a final word from Al Capp.
I won't be difficult. I agree, a lot of comics aren't very good, but also a lot of books aren't very good. A lot of plays aren't very good, and a lot of dramatic criticism is garbage. But they're not good or bad because they're written in book form or dramatic form or because it appears in the Saturday Review of Literature, but because they're created by good artists or bad ones. Now, Mr. Brown is sorry that Lil Abner is in Huckleberry Finn. I'm sorry that Mr. Brown isn't George G. Mason.
Thank you, Al Capp. Now, Miss Marya Mannes, please. Miss Mannes.
My fight against comics is that they kill time. They kill time that a child could use in playing, learning, and imagining, the three roots of growth. Because most comics are ugly, they blunt taste. Because a great many make a rule of violence, they blunt ethics. Because they're primitive in form and context, their highest appeal is to illiteracy and laziness. I believe that an indiscriminate diet of comics can produce an uncivilized and immature race.
Thank you, Miss Mannes. And now a final word from George Hecht.
Criticize the comics as much as you wish. We like to have you talk about them. It's good publicity. The facts remain. 1, that the comics supply millions of children and adults each day with good humor and exciting stories which interest and entertain them. And 2, that the comics can and will become a great medium of mass education, the potential usefulness of which is as yet scarcely realized.
Thank you, Mr. Hecht. And now Al Capp is waiting for a final word from John Mason Brown.
I don't care how popular comics are with the young, or worse still, with the old. They seem to me to be sad proofs of arrested underdevelopment. Time in the modern world is no longer something to be wasted. The moment has overtaken us, whether we like it or not, and most of us do not, when as a people we must grow up. In order to grow up, we must put behind us that fear of the best and that passion for the mediocre which most Americans cultivate.
Thank you, John Mason Brown, Mr. Hecht, Miss Mannes, and Al Capp for a thoroughly delightful and illuminating discussion. And our thanks also to Paul Sheldon of our town hall staff for the idea for this program. I think you all agree it was a success.
So for a program that was known for being popular, the popularity of this episode, I think, took everyone by surprise. Because within days, the station and the production team were receiving letters asking for the entire program to be replayed. People were either strongly agreeing or disagreeing with the points made. But one thing was for sure, a lot of people seemed to be caring about what was talked about on the night. It's interesting to think that at this point, nobody could know exactly how far this was all going to go and what the future held for comic books and for the government's interaction and reaction to what they were seeing in society at the time. The one thing I will say is this is probably the last time such a jovial tone would be taken when it came to talking about the war over comic books. The format was a great success, but the writing was already on the wall for America's Town Meeting. When Denny had originally made sure that he was neutral, that he wasn't picking one side or the other, as time went by and the world slipped into war, he couldn't seem to help himself, and he used his platform not just as an opportunity to open a debate, but for a chance to lecture people on his own views. It also didn't help that times were becoming darker. With war, people were becoming more frustrated, more impatient, and quite frankly ruder. Finally, television appeared, and that was it for radio programs like this. Though I have to say, I'm quite surprised that America's Town Meeting didn't try to move over to television. I think the format would have worked quite well, with known speakers talking in front of a camera and an audience interacting. I believe it could have worked, but for some reason it just seems like they never even tried. So this is clearly an important incident within the war on comic books, and one that I knew that I really had to highlight in the book. In the future, not too many of the people involved would be involved in the actual war on comic books, but they'd laid the groundwork. Lines had been drawn, new people would enter the argument, other people were listening to these programs and reacting to the programs and either agreeing or disagreeing, and they would form their own opinions, write their own pieces, which would then set fire to the argument all over again, and newspapers across the country would start running more and more stories about the problem with kids and their damn comic books. So it is an important opening salvo, although I don't think it was an opening salvo. A lot had been happening about comic books before this, but it was one of the first ones to really introduce it on a national scale, that there was a big problem, or at least a big argument, a big movement growing against comic books in the 1950s. I really enjoyed listening to this, and I hope you enjoyed it too. It's an important part of history, especially our history as comic book fans. I hope you liked it, and I hope you give more future programs a listen, and maybe pick up my book. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.